Welcome. My name is Gerald Hughes. I'm the director of the Neurolinguistic Learning Center here in California. I'd like to welcome you to our Introduction to Reading. Very briefly, we're going to take a look at reading as a process, as a series of physical or mental strategies, and why some folks seem to struggle with reading more than others. I'm going to give you an overview of how we address certain specific reading struggles in our various programs. We've got Reading Made Easy, we've got Reading with Dyslexia, we've even got a fun little application, Speed Reading Made Easy. These are our basic reading programs, and of course all these smaller programs are included in our parent-teacher trainings, and of course our learning specialist training, which has now been taught around the world. So sit back and enjoy the introduction to our Reading Made Easy program. So to begin with, we're going to look at some of the common struggles of reading. And it's kind of the first and the last thing on the list is focus and attention. If you're drifting off, if you're struggling with keeping your mind focused on what you're reading, it's going to be very, very difficult to retain that information. So paying attention, focus and attention is critical to the reading process. Lack of organization, reading in most cases is going to be delivering a lot of information, and it's important to organize that information. Our minds really don't like information just floating around kind of willy-nilly, just random. We really need to have that information organized and meaningful to retain it and utilize it. Some folks, for whatever reason, seem to have difficulty processing auditory information. They may or may not be diagnosed with a disorder such as dyslexia or auditory processing disorder, but certain learning styles tend to be more visual in the way they process information and in the way they relate to the world in general. For some folks, reading, writing, and spelling may kind of all come together. If someone's struggling with reading, writing, and spelling, I would definitely suspect dyslexia or some other issue. And I doubt that person is going to respond well to a phonics-based program. Memorization of spelling and vocabulary words, math facts, etc. requires sustained focus and attention. In fact, a significant number of children who get labeled or diagnosed as having poor comprehension are actually suffering from or struggling with poor retention. But the current testing methods generally, the simple ones that you would get in a school setting, generally don't distinguish between the two. So a student could have perfect comprehension, yet they're being treated, or their remediation for their struggle is going to be a remediation that's appropriate to a student that has poor comprehension. And this is going to be very frustrating when in fact the problem is retention rather than comprehension, or poor retention rather than poor comprehension, and the remediation is designed for poor comprehension. There's a good chance it's going to be frustrating to everyone, not just the student, but student and teacher alike. So those are the common reading struggles. Next, we're going to look at learning style, personality and learning style, because this is going to give you some insight into your way of learning or your child's way of learning. And in our model, we've come up with 4 basic learning styles or personality styles. If you're familiar with Myers-Briggs or the classic Greek temperaments, you may notice some familiarity here. And just for fun, I've actually included the characters of Winnie the Pooh as kind of an archetype, if you will, to these personality or learning styles. And what's different about our approach here is we're looking at learning and personality in terms of how you process information. That is the key, or it seems to be the key, in resolving some of these learning challenges. So very quickly, let's look at the 4 basic temperaments, or the 4 basic personality or learning styles. And the first 2 we're going to look at are Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore. Now, you can tell they're very, very different kind of personalities, but they have a lot of things in common. They're both very auditory in the way they process information. While Eeyore is definitely more kinesthetic and associated into his feelings, Winnie the Pooh is kind of a more matter of fact. He's kind of stepping back and seeing the world from this kind of neutral, kind of a third-party perspective. He's in it, but not sucked into it. These 2 personality styles tend to do very well in our public school, typical classroom setting. They are very auditory in the way they process information, very linear. They relate well to the pieces and the features of how information is presented in books and in conversation, which is conversation itself is a very linear process. And they really do tend to do well in that setting. Now, we have some other folks, our choleric, Mr. Rabbit, and sanguine, Tigger. These are going to be more visual, spatial in the way they process information. The rabbit, he's a little bit more standoffish, a little more dissociated, kind of like Pooh. He kind of wants to be in charge. These are folks that generally make good leaders, as opposed to your Tigger, your sanguine, who he wants to join the group. He doesn't want to lead the group. He wants to be a part of the group, and just he wants to go along for the ride and enjoy it. Again, both of these learning styles are going to be very visual in the way they process information. They tend to be external, a little bit more external in the way they process information. Of course, Tigger is going to be the most extroverted, with Winnie the Pooh and maybe the rabbit being more introverted. Very dynamic in the way they process information, which is great for puzzle solving and problem solving, but not so good when you're wanting to process information in a linear fashion, very from point to point, A, B, C, D. So they can be very intelligent, either one of these learning styles, but still they may struggle with certain aspects of classroom learning. So let's look a little bit deeper at the auditory versus visual thinkers. And you can go through this in more detail later on, but I just wanted to look at it very quickly and note that, again, the auditory or maybe left hemisphere learning style is going to be much more comfortable in a classroom setting where that information is going to be delivered in a more verbal or auditory format, whereas the visual thinker, the visual learner, he may be feeling a little bored in the classroom. Things may be moving a little too slow for him because he may be living in this visual soup to whatever degree. And again, the further away from this center cross that you go, that balance of logic and kinesthetic and auditory and visual, the further away from center you go, the more likely you are to run into some challenges in one or more areas of your life. When you get out to the extreme, you can see that you may run into issues such as attention deficit disorder, ADHD. You may have auditory processing disorder or a sensory processing disorder. And again, these may vary, but you can see the further away from center you go, the more likely you are to maybe wind up struggling with some areas. So we've got these visual and auditory thinkers. We know the auditory folks do really well in the classroom. Let's look at the 2 kind of basic styles of reading And the first style or approach to reading is going to be the auditory, phonetic reading style or reading approach. And we're all familiar with this. Probably 99% of us, this is the way we were taught to read. And we visually break the word into pieces, either letters or syllables or letter combination, and we sound out each piece. Hopefully we have some sense of recognition. We call this a synesthesia, a sense of knowing which sound corresponds to which letter or letter combination. And we loop around here several times depending upon the length of the word, and then ultimately we reassemble them inside our mind, and boom, we can read or spell the word. So that's your basic style of phonetic reading. That's how we're taught to read. We are taught to memorize a certain number of sight words to build up our vocabulary, and folks would argue that, that's a visual or whole word approach to reading. But the truth is, the basic formula for reading is to see the words, sound them out, and then extrapolate the meaning as we work our way through the sentence or the reading material. Now, a very different way to read, but one that's actually been around for years. This is not new. I didn't invent it. I can't take credit for this. Is reading visually, and that is recognize the word as it was memorized. Again, looking for that synesthesia, that sense of knowing or that feeling of recognition, and then simultaneously recalling both the sound of the word and the meaning of the word. This is a very different process, and it's not about phonics versus whole language. They're both part of the process, but they're kind of reordered. So rather than sounding out the word to get the meaning, we recognize the word and get the sound of the word. And obviously for that to occur, you have to have a full phonetic understanding of the word. But what we have found is that it is not necessary to memorize thousands and thousands of words. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions that's out there, because once you've memorized probably 300 words, you've memorized, and this probably happens before you even get to the first grade or kindergarten, for most children, you've memorized all the phonetic combinations. You know all the sounds there are. So now, by the time you memorize visually 300 words or so, you've seen every phonetic combination there is. You've seen all the, most of the common syllables and virtually all the letter combinations that there are to know. And now, through the process of pattern recognition, not decoding, but with pattern recognition, you can see that bat is the same is very similar to hat, and bed is similar to bad, and your mind will work with that. It's really amazing, and again, this is not rocket science. This has been around for years, and it maybe just hasn't been applied to learning to read or in such a way that can overcome the, let's call it the hype or the dedication, if you will, to that phonics-based approach to reading, learning to read phonetically. Are there any other myths? Well, I think the biggest myth of all is that there's one correct method for teaching students to read. There's 4 different learning styles, each one with its own strengths and weaknesses. The 2 that we're primarily dealing with today are visual and verbal, those 2 strengths. As far as phonics versus whole language or sight reading, research shows that children learn with a combination of both. So what we want to do here is take kind of the best of both worlds, and we're not going to favor whole language or sight reading versus phonics, but we're going to put the 2 together in a way that makes sense. So now that we've kind of established this foundation, what we're going to do is move on to the 6 components of reading. There are 6 things that need to happen in order to see those words on the page, comprehend the meaning, and retain that meaning. And the first is obviously our vision. sensing, being able to sense what's on the page through our eyes. So it's really important if someone is experiencing a reading struggle, have those eyes checked. Make sure that they don't need glasses or contacts. Number 2, auditory sensing. Whatever strategy you use for reading, it is going to be incredibly helpful to be able to hear those phonics sounds properly. So again, everyone at some point every child should probably have their hearing checked to make sure that they are getting those sounds. Number 3, visual perception. Now this is really where our program takes off. This is where we're going to get into the meat of the program here, because how you process visual information, how you perceive it, and specifically those two-dimensional symbols and letters, that could pose a problem. Now in its extreme, this is going to probably result in something like dyslexia or dysgraphia or some other problem. But in a relatively light form of this visual perception, it could simply be slowing down your reading. So we are going to address this a little bit just to make sure those eyes are working together, and we want to see those letters as they are, not how we think they are. Number 4, auditory perception. Again, we want to look at this phenomenon of pattern recognition versus decoding. And either one is fine, but the truth is most people will find that if they can recognize the patterns of what they're reading, they're going to be able to read faster than by decoding, which is inherently a slow process. So we're going to try to introduce the reader, the student, to a style of reading that utilizes pattern recognition rather than decoding. Number 5, visual auditory integration. This is critical for comprehension. So you're seeing the words, you're hearing what you're reading, and you need to integrate that into one coherent piece of information that will allow you to understand what you're reading. And finally, number 6, sustained focus and attention. Again, we talked about this, that for some children, some children who may be described as having poor comprehension, they may in fact be struggling with poor retention. So we're gonna provide some skills and techniques to address that specific issue of retention.
Well, that's it for our introduction to reading. We've taken a look at some common reading struggles. We've looked at learning styles and personality as they relate to process and perception. We've taken a look at the auditory and visual thinkers and their relative strengths and weaknesses. We've dissected reading into its 6 basic components and looked at how each of these components is essential in its own way to effective reading. We've taken a brief look at visual reading and how some students will benefit from this different approach that is not based on processing information auditorily. On behalf of myself and the other folks at the Neurolinguistic Learning Center, I want to thank you and encourage you to look into our other programs, find the help you need, and go for it. Thank you.